Hi, everybody. Sam Dalrymple's Shattered Lands, Five Partitions, and the Making of Modern Asia. This book is one of the most talked about books of 2025. Let me hold it up a little longer. It is on several book of the year lists as well as bestseller lists. Now, what this book does is spotlights five partitions that have led to modern Asia or the Asia that we know today. Now, in India, we are familiar with two partitions. In fact, we are fixated on them, and understandably so. That's India and Pakistan, and subsequently Pakistan and Bangladesh. But the other three partitions put together with those two really help us understand or make more sense of contemporary politics as well as everyday history. I'm delighted to be talking today to the author of this book, historian, filmmaker, and author, as I said, Sam Dalrymple. Sam, thank you. Did I miss out an adjective or a noun to describe you? I think traveler. Should I
No,
have
no,
said
that's
traveler?
perfect. Thanks for having me on the show.
Traveler should have been right up there, isn't it? Because I do follow you on X and your Substack posts, and you take so much joy in traveling.
Yeah, no, I mean that's ultimately, I think one of the key backgrounds of this book is that I spend every waking hour charging off in search of old buildings and kind of stories from small towns that I can write about. And a lot of the book and a lot of the stories surrounding these partitions have come from small towns dotted along the subcontinent where someone's introduced me to their family history and suddenly opened some new door.
What made you look at Asia and the Indian Empire or the British Indian Empire through this lens of the five partitions? What was your quest?
Sure. So it really began in university. I was in the UK. I grew up in Delhi, but then in the UK, I had this kind of strange moment with Indian and Pakistani friends. First, realizing that here in the UK and South Asia's former colonizer, it was easier for Indians and Pakistanis to meet than in the subcontinent itself. And we set up this organization called Project Astan that was essentially documenting partition memory. It was coming up to the 75th anniversary, which was 2022. And, much like Holocaust memory and World War II memory, there are stories that every family has with partition, and yet they are very often not recorded. People have never, sat down to properly ask these questions. And within just 5 years, many of these stories will be gone because that generation is getting older now. But then it was about 4 years into this project that I sat down with a man from Tripura, and we were asking about how partition affected the Northeast because it's completely reshaped the Northeast, and yet the Northeast very rarely gets brought into discussions about partition.
Absolutely.
Um, and his response was, "Which one? Which partition are you talking about?" Because if you were living in Tripura or Mizoram or Nagaland, then there are three major ruptures. Burma's separation in 1937 is as important as 47 and 71. And this got me thinking because Burma's there on all the maps that we grow up with of the Raj, and yet no one ever thinks to question it. And there are songs that, we
Yeah.
hear, old Bollywood songs like Mera Piya Ge Rangoon,
Yeah.
that
Bhagwan
highlight these,
Dada's. It was a very popular song, and
yeah,
Bhagwan Dada was a huge star.
that
Yeah.
that highlight these connections
Yeah.
to Burma, and yet it's somehow a largely forgotten story. And it was whilst researching the Burma angle that I also came across the fact that much of the Gulf was
Yeah.
part of the Raj. And basically, the place that this book comes from is a realization around the time of COVID that the Raj was almost 2.5 times the size of modern India, and stretched from modern day Yemen to modern day Burma. And that there are five major ruptures, not just one or two, which have transformed, Britain's Indian Empire, as it's called on the passports of the time,
Yeah.
into 12 distinct nation states. Everything from Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. All of these states were in some way part of this British Indian Empire. And today, the the historical links which once tied these regions together have, I think, themselves been partitioned. The archives themselves have been partitioned. Memory has been partitioned. And so we rarely read about all of these regions even in the same books. If you want to study Burma, you usually have to go to the Southeast Asian department rather than the South Asian department. And if you want to study Yemen, you have to go to the Middle East section of the bookshop.
You mentioned the song Mere Piya Gaye Rangoon, right? We've grown up knowing about Dhirubhai Ambani starting off in Aden. We go to Mumbai's Colaba Causeway, and you have a lot of shops and hotels where people from these West Asian countries, visit very regularly. And there's a very major to and fro, or a regular to and fro, which has got historic origins. So what I'm trying to get at is how your book and your research help illuminate many things that we sort of know, but we don't know how it came about, or don't stop to think about how it came about. Or, those beautiful Burma teak homes in Chettinad.
Chettinad. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm saying, all of this, we know, we see, we're familiar, but they're fragments and we don't understand why they came about, even though we're so familiar with it. So I think that is one of the biggest things that Shattered Lands will do for many of its readers. But let me get back to this spread of the British Indian Empire, the Indian Empire. Let's start with the East, because most people won't know or may be unfamiliar with the fact that Burma and this partition that you just referred to in 1937 could have been part of India. I want you to talk a little bit about why it wasn't a part of India, because you've quoted Mahatma Gandhi as saying that that Burma cannot be a part of India under self rule, and that there was no doubt in his mind about that. So why did this happen?
Sure. I think the Burma partition story is fascinating for so many reasons.
Yeah.
I think for one, it lays the foundations for all the subsequent partitions. The first ever declaration in favor of creating Pakistan by Rahmat Ali Chaudhry refers to it as, I can't understand why, if Burma is to be separated, we can't also have a separate Muslim state. So the justification for the further partitioning of the subcontinent is based on this event that we've completely brushed over in our history textbooks. So I think for the first thing to emphasize is how much more tied together the histories of Burma and India really are. So, every king in Burmese history had to be crowned by a Manipuri Brahmin. Indians bring Buddhism from India to Burma. And when the Brits conquer Northeast India, they're conquering it from the Burmese Empire, in a sense. So Assam, the Ahoms of us who give their name to Assam are from Shan State, Burma. So these regions are far more tied together than we tend to think. But by the 1920s, Indian nationalists are beginning to wonder what a future Indian nation should actually look like, basically. And there are two basic models. One is that Indian nationalists should remove the British, but then essentially keep the steel frame of British India and inherit a massive super colony stretching from Yemen to Burma. And that's the kind of, the most popular Burmese politician is this guy called Mahatma Gandhi. He's the head of the local Congress chapter in Rangoon. He's a disciple of Gandhi, and he spends a huge amount of his career basically arguing that Burma should remain a part of India. And he thinks, and these early debates actually read quite a bit like Brexit debates. There's both an angle of kind of, immigration is changing the nature of our society, but also we are benefiting from being part of this incredibly massive kind of customs union. This economic bloc and this military bloc, which that they wanted to preserve, essentially. And interestingly, Mahatma Gandhi is a disciple of Gandhi, but he falls out with Gandhi. Why? Because Gandhi becomes the figurehead of this alternative vision of what the basis of the Indian nation can be. And his vision, like many Hindus, particularly around Gujarat and Maharashtra, and also a bit in Bengal at this time, imagine a future Indian nation that bears the contours of Bharatvarsh, this ancient concept rooted in the Mahabharata thousands of years ago, but that has never actually been the basis for a political state before. You know, there has never been a country called Bharatvarsh politically unified. It's a cultural region as set out in the epics. But much like kind of, Europe until the EU, it had never been existed as a political entity before.
Yeah.
And so Gandhi starts actively campaigning to remove Burma and remove the Arabian states and create a Bharat that stretches from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Sindh to Assam. And it's
Oh,
the
interesting.
the tussle between these two visions of India that really comes to the fore. And it's interestingly the tussle between these two visions which ultimately will alienate people like Jinnah. Jinnah, in the early
Yeah.
days, is one of the great Indian nationalists, and he's horrified when essentially all the non-Hindu bits of the Raj are suddenly separated off, transforming, the Raj into a Hindu-dominated state for the first time in 1937. And I think so much of the debates about why the Pakistan demand grows so quickly can't be understood if you don't understand the fact that the Brits, with one fell swoop in 37, create a Hindu dominated state.
It is particularly fascinating to hear this now in the context of the past 15 years and the ruling BJP and the RSS and its rise and consolidation of power in India and their idea of the Hindu Rashtra. It is we when you hear about the freedom struggle and the independence movement, you tend not to look at it through the lens of being a Hindu Rashtra unless you go in deep, which you're doing, and bringing to light. Sam, let's talk about the Arabian states. I mean, obviously the oil wasn't there and wasn't discovered at that time. Otherwise, why would we have given it up?
Sure. So this is definitely the bit of the book that has, I think, gained the most press, is this kind of forgotten fact that Indian passports are being issued as far west as Aden.
Yeah.
There, if you go to Tel Aviv's museum in Israel, there is a passport of a Yemeni Jewish woman who tried to migrate from Yemen to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration. And in order to make that migration, she has to travel on an Indian passport because by virtue of her being Yemeni, she is an Indian citizen. And it's actually, and the rupee is used in the Gulf. The Indian army is the reason that many of these sheikdoms, like Dubai, are not annexed by Saudi Arabia. It's because they're under the Indian army's protection. They are princely states, and the list of princely states issued by Britain that includes Hyderabad and Jaipur and Jodhpur and Kochi and Manipur and Tripura and all these princely states that we know about. That list actually opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi. And goes on to list other states. And so this region was, I think, much less integrated into the Raj.
When you said this area was much less integrated, you mean geographically, in terms of access, physical access.
Yes, I think Aden, which is now in Yemen, was very much part of the Bombay Presidency and was largely a kind of Arab and Gujarati dominated city. But I think that the average person living in Dubai or Qatar, etc., would have identified as Khaliji or Arab rather than Indian per se, and that there was a lot less kind of political involvement in these at the grassroots level. But you did have this gradual Indianization of the Gulf over the course of about 100 years, and particularly after 1903, when Lord Curzon has a Darbar in Sharjah and subsequently invites all the Gulf sheikhs off to the Delhi Darbars in Delhi. And so, for example, you get the Sultan of Oman attending Mayo College in Rajasthan. You get the invention of Halim. Halim is a Yemeni dish which is brought by a bunch of Yemeni sheikhs to Hyderabad and mixed with Telugu spices and Andhra spices and becomes the dish that we know today as a result of this kind of Indo-Arab world that we've forgotten about. In addition to the sheikdoms of the Gulf, there were also sheikdoms across the coast of Gujarat that, again, we've forgotten about. The Sheikh of Mangrul, for example, which is now in Kathiawar. So this is a world which is far more tied together than we think. And you have, although in most of the kind of princely India sections of the Gulf, Dubai, Qatar, etc., no one's really thinking of themselves as Indian. What's interesting is in Aden, in southern Yemen, they are. And there's a fascinating account by this Arab journalist called Muhammad Ali Luqman. And Luqman is right, Luqman's traveling with Ambedkar. He's Gandhi's Arabic translator. And his cousins are all living in Gujarat. And he imagines in his early days a future where Arab is an Indian ethnicity alongside Punjabi, Telugu, Tamil, Kashmiri, etc. But he becomes disillusioned with this idea in the course of the 1930s, basically. And so it's a fascinating story, the story of Luqman, and it highlights a whole forgotten history. Now, ultimately, the thing that deals the death blow to this Indo-Arab world is multifold. Firstly, it's the separation of Burma. And you have all of these reformists in the Arab world looking over their shoulder and saying, well, if Indian nationalists want their state to resemble Bharat Varsh, we're also not part of that. And so first Aden is separated off in 37. And then in 47, the Persian Gulf residency is finally separated off as well. What's fascinating here is that the Brits aren't necessarily doing the kind of divide and rule thing that we'd expect them to do. They are offering up these princely states to the future Indian government.
So
And
you're saying that the Indian freedom fighters and the leaders of the freedom movement at that point, the politicians at that point, they actually said they didn't want these kingdoms. They didn't
yeah, so
want
there
these.
there are a few who do. I think I can't remember his name. Sapru is one of the leading Indian nationalists who really jumps on this campaign and says, no, we should keep all this region. But by and large, Indian nationalists again are saying, these areas aren't in the Mahabharata, so we're fine with separating them off.
Wow.
And there's a quote from the British legation in Tehran, where there's a bunch of British diplomats who are involved in the bureaucracy of transferring this region, and they write that it was with apparent unanimity that government of India officials told them that they had absolutely no interest in
Wow.
running the Persian Gulf states after Indian independence, because the government of India, Sardar Patel, Nehru, etc., are all imagining this as a potential drain on the Indian exchequer. And the oil's yet to be discovered, and so it's seen as we're going to have to kind of patrol these waters on the other side of the Arabian Sea with little to no economic benefit from us. And as far as they're concerned, the only reason that these states were attached to India at all was as petrol refueling ports, so that ships coming in from Britain could stop for petrol en route to India, en route to Bombay. Of course, just 10 years later, the situation looks very different because oil is suddenly being discovered en masse.
It's really fascinating. I mean, I really don't think too many people know this, and it'll give people a lot to talk about and to think about. I want to get into the kingdoms and the princely states and that partition, but just before that, all these references that you make, the passport in the museum in Tel Aviv, a letter somewhere, a public document, this is humongous research, and over, I'm guessing, 12 nations at least, if and public libraries, public archives, as well as private documents and private records, and primary sources of interviews, isn't it? Tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about the research, and then I'll go back to the
sure.
princely states.
No, thank you for that. So a lot of my early research obviously came from oral histories. That was my background through Project Astan, this partition
Yes.
interviewing organization. So I'd done that in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh already, collected maybe 100 interviews on 47 specifically. But then, yeah, so then once I began writing this book around COVID, I started using government archives mainly in India and in Britain, but also, a lot of the countries that are involved with this book, particularly Myanmar and Yemen, are very difficult to do research in these days. And so, Myanmar, I managed to get in touch with some researchers who'd scanned a lot of the documents in the archives there before the coup. And so, because now it's impossible to go into the archives and do research, you'll get arrested. And likewise, Yemen, I think, so much of it's just been burnt in the civil war that it's very impossible to do stuff. But again, when, I flew into Oman to interview a lot of families there, go through their private collections. I flew into Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where this deposed sultan from what's now Eastern Yemen, Ghalib al-Qaiti, has this extraordinary private collection of documents that he still has on his person, in suitcases and stuff. And I think, in places like Yemen, where I wasn't able to do archival research, I managed to find private archives that could fill that gap. One of the best private archives that I came across was I actually ended up staying in Lahore with the family of Sarfaroz Khan Noon, who was the last democratic prime minister of Pakistan before the first military coup. And so he resolves a lot of the border tensions with India. He's the person who buys Gwadar, the port, from Oman and brings it into Pakistan. And then it's whilst he's negotiating kind of, to resolve everything regarding Kashmir that suddenly there's the first Pakistani coup, the military takes over and everything else disappears. Anyway, in their house, they have the letter. They have the letter that ends Pakistani democracy, and it's sitting there on their mantelpiece. And I'm not sure how many other scholars have seen that before, kind of thing. And I think that there's a lot of these documents that are sitting in private archives and people's attics that are not in the government museums or in government archives, and thus have been neglected by scholars.
Just hearing and reading about your discoveries are so thrilling. So I can imagine what it must have been for you to perhaps stumble upon these things or just come upon them. It's really quite a thrill, I'm guessing.
It is. I think the other great one was there's this guy called Sanveer who I know from London. Sanveer does kind of the PR for Dishoom, the lovely London Indian restaurant. And his granddad was one of the first Sikh models for Mossbros, the clothing company. And I was chatting to him about potentially doing a partition interview with his granddad and was telling him about my book, etc. And then he's like, "Oh, you're doing Burma too? We've got a bunch of stuff in our attic, regarding my family's migration back from Burma." And anyway, they turned out to have a diary written in Punjabi of the migration of the Sikh miners of Bordwin from Shan State, Burma, back to Punjab during World War II. And it's one of the most extraordinary documents that I've ever read. It reads like a kind of Sikh version of Apocalypse Now, with 40 Sikh families on rafts floating up the Chindwin River as the Japanese and Brits are having kind of dogfights in the air, as kids are getting taken away by leopards, as refugees are dying in the jungles, and leeches are kind of, getting into everyone's shoes. And it's the most extraordinary story. And one which until now has largely been told by kind of white British officers, or if not, then kind of anglicised upper class Indians who, could afford cars and stuff like that. Whereas this testimony is really different. It's from the perspective of the mining foreman from this kind of small Sikh settlement in Shan State, Burma. Extraordinary.
Let me take you back to the partition and the princely states. I'm curious about how Bhutan and Nepal did not become part of either India or Pakistan in the way that a lot of the other princely states did.
Sure. So the most analogous states within the Raj was always a hodgepodge of different statuses. Much like Britain itself had kind of, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Even within Britain, there are kind of a hodgepodge of different identities, etc. So within the Raj, you had directly British-ruled India. Then you had princely states, and then you had a series of protectorates. Now, Nepal and Oman were both two unique cases, and then to some extent Bhutan as well, because they were legally recognized by international treaties as independent states. And yet they were integrated into the Raj regardless and were informally given the exact same status as everyone else. So there would be a residency, the Indian legal service would be extended into these areas. There's a book called Monsoon Revolutions by Abdul Razak Takriti in Oman. And it's the most fascinating book on how, on the kind of informal ways that the Raj shows up in this region. The way, and you know, this is why the Gurkhas were brought into the Indian army, for example. You know, there are all these ties. And if you look at the list of princely states, they're there. When you look at the photos of the Delhi Darbar, you know, the Ranas of Nepal and the Sultans of Muscat and Oman are standing there next to the Maharaja of Jaipur and Jodhpur. But so what happens is Nepal and Bhutan specifically, in 1946, they begin to realize that the princely era is over and India is, you know, although the princes themselves don't realize it, they realize that the princely order is somewhat doomed, essentially. And so they lobby together as Himalayan states, along with Sikkim, that their states have always been more closely connected to Tibet than to India in historic times. And also they argue along the basis of race. And they specifically use all of these arguments that were previously used in the Burma separation debates. They use they use the example of Burma as an example for why they also, often kind of Buddhist populations, etc., should be allowed independence as well. And currently, you know, this is a moment before the violence of partition breaks out. Before even they managed to do this early on, whilst the cabinet mission plan is still kind of being negotiated. And so they managed, because of their speed, essentially, they win a legal case which says, you know, yes, our early treaties called us independent states, and although provisionally we were kind of part of the Raj for bureaucratic reasons, we've never actually given up our sovereignty. And that is carried through, so that because they managed to win this legal case so early, it's recognized by both the Indian and Pakistani subsequent governments. And it's just a matter of timing, though. They managed to, and they managed to have all these documents. And crucially, also, I think that they had always been regarded as somewhat exceptional cases. And you read this in the files, even in the 1920s, British officials are writing of the specific cases of Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim, these Himalayan states, which are different to the rest of the princely order. And as a result, the Chamber of Princes never has Nepal being represented, because it's always regarded as a sort of, well, they're not entirely part of the Indian system, although provisionally they are.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, especially when you then look at the other states. I mean, I won't go, too much into detail there, because I think people should just get the book to go into it. But I really want you to talk a little bit about Hyderabad, because I mean, we talk a lot about Kashmir, and we continue to talk about Kashmir in contemporary politics, of course. But talk a little bit about Hyderabad, because you make this point about how partition and the southern states, or the central southern states, does not get talked about in the same sentence, in a way, and there is a sort of a lack of knowledge, maybe, or even just conversation about this.
Sure. I think in general, there is far too little discussion on the integration of the princely states. The fact is that very few of these states were actually lobbying to join the Indian Union. And as remarkable as it seems today, very few of them were part of the Indian Union on Independence Day. So, you can look up, I think it's the Hindu newspaper, look on the Independence Day front cover of the newspaper, and you have a map of India without any of the princely states integrated into it yet, because that's what India looked like on Independence Day. It's not the map that we are used to today, that really comes into effect in 1949, and really kind of Republic Day, 1950. So I think in general, a lot of the princely stories aren't talked about. And when they are, they kind of rely on a single source, which is a brilliant source, which is that of VP Menon's memoirs. VP Menon is Sardar Patel's number two. He, like Patel, is very much involved in the integration of the princely states into India. But he only really gives certain sides of the story, and far too often, all books that talk about these states' attempts to remain independent only utilize this kind of, Indian government side perspective. And the fact of the matter is that Hyderabad's attempt to remain independent, Hyderabad was larger than most UN nation states at the time and had an economy that rivaled Belgium's. It had its own airlines, it had its own currency. So it really was, for all intents and purposes, an independent state, but it didn't really have an army and it didn't have international recognition as such. Now, what happens is, it's got a Muslim nizam and a mostly Hindu population, but it's also incredibly feudal. And you get very importantly a communist revolution in the countryside, the Telangana armed struggle. And to put down this armed struggle, the Nizam, who in his early days is actually a pretty secular guy, begins to lean more and more on this kind of Islamist militia called the Razakars, who, in addition to shooting communists, also just go around burning temples and that kind of thing. And gradually, the state turns into civil war, basically, in the course of 1948. And there's a bunch of amazing memoirs from Hyderabad on this whole period that show a lot more complexity than I think the Bollywood depictions that we're seeing at the moment on this whole conflict. And ultimately, the Indian Army just goes in September 1948. And although it's referred to as the police action, it's essentially a military annexation. The planes, tanks, jeeps roll in with machine guns. And although we never talk about South India when it comes to partition, we tend to think of partition as something that happened in Punjab, as if it's a kind of event that's limited to that region. There is 3 times more displacement across the borders of Hyderabad state in the year 1948 than there was in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. So it's an extraordinary level of violence, extraordinary level of displacement, and one
And
which is essentially rubbed off. Yeah. Sorry?
and the magnitude of people affected, just the sheer volume of people affected.
It's extraordinary. And, today you can go to Karachi and you can find a whole quarter of the city that is made up of Hyderabadi exiles. There is a little roundabout with an image of the Charminar on it for that reason, because of the number of people who fled Hyderabad for Pakistan in the wake of this annexation. And likewise, you have huge numbers of Hindus and Sikhs and Sufis and Jains who fled Hyderabad for, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra as a result of the kind of Razakar terror. There's so much that changes in the demographic makeup of South India as a result of this whole conflict that I think is far too frequently reduced to quite a simple kind of Hindu-Muslim binary. It's far more complicated and fascinating and traumatic for the region than I think we tend to realize.
We are talking at a time where India's neighborhood is seeing a lot of upheaval. We have Bangladesh, we have Nepal, the student-led agitations and the regime changes that we have witnessed. When you look at this neighborhood from the perspective of shattered lands and what you've seen, are there any themes that you think we need to engage with, we need to understand, given the way where India's neighborhood is at this point of time? We fought a war this year, the 6-day Operation Sindoor. We've seen what's happening, in Nepal and Bangladesh. The Rohingyas, people who don't belong anywhere now. It seems nobody wants them. Is there do you want to look at is there anything in shattered lands that helps us assess what is going on right now? Are there lessons in your book and your research that should be considered when people are dealing with what we are today?
It's a complicated question, but I'll
Yeah.
try my best to give a few pointers, I guess. I think one is that this region is so intimately tied together, and that every time, I think far too frequently, the borders that separate all these countries are regarded as ancient cultural divides, and the ties which link the people on either side of these borders are brushed over, and in so doing, basically, kind of creating huge upheaval. So I think, I think one of the great tragedies of Indian foreign policy over the last decade or so has been the way that India has alienated, I think, quite a lot of its neighborhood,
Neighbors.
with
Yeah.
whom, and particularly, I think Nepal being a good example, and Bangladesh, in Bangladesh today, there is a huge amount of resentment against India for not having kind of helped the students create a viable alternative to Sheikh Hasina, who was regarded as an autocrat. And yes, India was very concerned that it could lead to a whole upset in the revival of Islamism in the region, etc. But I think that there is a sense when you visit Dhaka now that India could have helped more create a viable alternative rather than what we're seeing now, where it's going into complete chaos. And I think that the final thing is that recently, with the recent kind of war operations in May, was it? I think Trump was saying that India and Pakistan have been fighting over Kashmir for thousands of years, and the extraordinary fact of the matter is that none of the borders surrounding India, really, with the exception of maybe the border between India and China, which was India and Tibet beforehand, and maybe yeah, I mean that's kind of it. None of these other borders that India has really existed within the last 100 years ago today, and they are all recent inventions, with very real, consequences that people continue to live with in these border regions. And it's and we need to know this stuff. We need to know how the creation of the India-Myanmar border destabilized Nagaland and Mizoram, and the classic excuses for those separatist movements are, oh, they're really far away and kind of weren't as integrated into the rest of Indian society beforehand. And that's not true. It's that they were destabilized by newly created borders, that places like Tripura, that had been right next door to Chittagong, Bengal's largest port, was suddenly 2,100 miles away from the nearest port, which was Kolkata. And suddenly, the entire economies of these regions were destabilized, altered, identities had to shift overnight. And I think that in ignoring the multiplicity of identity, but also the recentness of these borders, we risk kind of, getting ourselves further lost in a sense. I hope that answers your question.
You're on the festival circuit now. There is a lot of attention, well deserved attention, respect, and love that this book is getting. Are you getting different reactions from different cities? You mentioned Dhaka, you were in Bombay, you will be in Bangalore. So are you seeing?
Yeah, no, I think every country and every region has had a slightly different reaction. I think that, for
Curious.
example, I began in the UK, and I think it was fascinating that when I went to Ireland, then how much larger the crowds were, because obviously, and how much closer the subject felt to people. In Dublin specifically, there was a real sense that partition is Irish history too. And, the British Empire partitioning Ireland on the
Yeah.
basis of Catholic and Protestant, it was a familiar theme. And so I think that there was an extraordinary closeness to the subject, which people living in Edinburgh didn't necessarily have in the same way. I think then coming out to, I was just in Yangon in Myanmar, much smaller crowds than before, because obviously, the coup has reduced everything in that country. But still, we had a good 50 people, and it was extraordinary hearing how the separation of Burma is understood there in relation to their own civil war that's currently going on, and the way that it destabilized different ethnic groups. And I think within India, I mean, for the most part, obviously, Punjab and Kolkata and Shillong obviously have, this is a subject that's very dear to everyone's hearts. But I think that the broader thing, that this is a pan-subcontinental story, I think has proved true. When I go down south, still everyone seems to have family who was affected by partition. When you go to the Deccan, everyone's got family affected by the partition. I think that far too frequently we imagine that partition was, as I said before, something that happened in Punjab and maybe in Bengal, as opposed to something that affected every single part of India. And you go to, if you try to list Bombay's greatest writers, it's impossible to create a list without Manto, who was now is Pakistani, but he never regarded himself as such necessarily. He always thought of Bombay as his real home. When you go to Chennai, there are huge numbers of people with family links to Burma. When you go to Kerala, there are people who've got links with the Gulf, etc., etc., etc. And so I think that has been one of the great surprises. Yeah.
I'm going to let you go because I think people need to read this book. I hope our conversation helps pique people's interest and curiosity because it really is worth your time. But Sam, I want to know, when I look at this book and I look at all these, what are they called? On these endorsements or these reviews or these little notes, I noticed one notable, absence, and that is William Dalrymple, whose name would have been right up there if it was somebody else who had written this book, right? That would be the first person you'd reach out to. But he's been very proud. We've been hearing his posts and he's been sharing all of that. What has he told you he feels about this book?
I
And
think
he's very proud. We can see
I
that.
think he's a proud dad. He obviously, so I mean, before this book I was very much in film and in a very different world.
Yes.
And I think he finds it rather funny that I've sort of suddenly moved into the same field as him. And yeah, I think he rather loves it. He obviously does more he does an earlier time period. He very much covers kind of, ancient India up to the kind of Mughal period, whereas this is very much the last 40 years story. But yeah, I think he likes it.
Dalrymple and Son. We we owe Dalrymple and Son a great, debt of gratitude for the kind of work that you've done. And Shattered Lands continues what we are used to getting from this family. Thank you, Sam. Sorry I made it about your dad towards the end, but I've had the pleasure and
You're
privilege
allowed.
recording a lot of conversations with him right from the day of the first, the White Mughals, right from that time over the years. We've had several conversations, so I had to close it in this manner. But this is really all about you and your book. Thank you, Sam. All the best.
Bye.